you might be playing for your job if you're Scott Frost at this point. This might be, is it possible, Mark, that this is his last game as the Huskers head coach? I mean, I wouldn't say it's likely. I think it's more than likely he returns given the staffing changes. But if he loses this game, it's convincing. Boy, I'd have to think he's still in the hot seat this offseason. What are your thoughts on that?
The comparison I would make in situation would be to what's recently happened at Florida, in that there were assistant coaches let go with a few games left in the season. So at Florida, it was a defense issue. It was an offensive line issue. Those were longtime assistants of Dan Mullen, who had been with him all the way back to Mississippi State. And so the thought was, okay, you have retained these guys based on your relationship. Enough is enough. You need to make changes now. He made changes. And I thought at the time, okay, this is in place of him being let go, is that he's making the changes required. We've seen this multiple times. We saw this with Jim Harbaugh last offseason at Michigan. We've seen this with Brian Kelly at Notre Dame in 2016, where there was enough faith in the head coach to say, we still believe in you, but there are obvious issues with your coaching staff that we need to see addressed. Make those changes. Dan Mullen made those changes. His performance on the field continued to falter the next few weeks. Then he gets fired. I thought the same thing in regards to Scott Frost. Most likely that being the move that was being made is that, okay, we're giving Scott Frost one additional year, but we need to know that there are changes being made. They let go 4 offensive assistants going into the Wisconsin game. And, but I got to think, with the performance that they put on the field on the road at Wisconsin, and anything short of getting blasted in some embarrassing fashion against Iowa, that he's retained his job. That's what I think.
And I think that makes sense. I'd probably agree with you on that. I'm no Husker expert. I reflected on this last night during our live show with Don Patterson. I cannot believe Nebraska is 3-8. I just can't believe it. And their one win is a blowout win over, or their one conference win is a blowout win over Nebraska or Northwestern. If you look at their win-loss record in the Big Ten, so they're 1-7 in the Big Ten. I believe they've scored. Now I'm quoting this from memory. I'd have to look. Their points for are 218. Their points against are 211, and they're 1-7. That's just unreal. That's unheard of. Now, so I don't know how you weigh that. If you're Trev Alberts, how do you look at that? Is it, okay, we're close, we're in all these games, we could easily be 8-3, or even better, you could be maybe 9-2, or I mean, conceivably, I guess you could be, because all these games have been close that they've lost. Or do you look at it and say, look, we got a serious coaching issue if we're this close and yet we just cannot win a football game? I think you can look at it both ways, and you
can.
I don't know. I don't know how he's looking at it. Certainly, the like you mentioned, the coaching staff adjustments that were made here during the season would indicate that Scott's being given more time regardless of what happens in this game. I think if you're an Iowa fan, you probably like that. You don't want Scott Frost to be feeling the heat this week, because I don't know if there's a percentage of his locker room that he's lost. I guess that's always possible, but if there is or there isn't, like, you don't want even the few players that are behind him, even if there are just a few players behind him, you don't want those players playing for his job, because, that gives them extra motivation. This is their postseason. It's their last game of the season. And if it's their last game with Scott Frost, they could come out here, regardless if it's a backup quarterback, and do something they haven't been able to do all year, and that's close out a game. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but if I'm an Iowa fan, I would much prefer Scott Frost's job be reassured to him moving forward prior to this game. And I'm sure Scott's, like you mentioned, he's had those conversations with Trev. I'm sure he knows where he stands. I suppose he could always be blindsided, but given his pedigree and his relationship with that program and just his history, I don't think there's going to be. That's where I would say maybe a little bit different from the Dan Mullen situation, is Nebraska has such a loyalty to him for what he's done as a player for that program, that I think they're gonna give him a longer leash regardless.
Agreed. Although I would say that Mullen does have a history with Florida going back to the Urban Meyer days as offensive coordinator there, but yes, not to the level that we see with Nebraska and Scott
Sure.
Frost winning a national championship as a quarterback. Getting back to your first point in regards to how to view these games, because when you roll out the names Ohio State, Michigan, Michigan State on down the line, now Wisconsin last weekend, and consider how well that they've played in all those games, then that seems to be an indicator that this team is good. This team, based on their performances against those four, should be beating the likes of Minnesota and Illinois and Purdue. But of course, they're not. They're losing in the same fashion to those teams as they are to the heavyweights. And, you referenced a game in what would have been 2018, Scott Frost's first year, in which I believe Iowa kicked a field goal at the gun to win 31-28, I think. And that game, when you said, you can look at this from both sides in regards to the close losses just being excruciating. And, we need to win these games. We need to close out. This is coaching, not making adjustments, not preparing the team, not getting it to the point to make the right decisions in the closing minutes. Or is this, we're hanging with Ohio State and Michigan and all these other teams. We're pretty good. We're right there. I think that evaluation is made differently in year 4, and certainly next year is year 5 than it was in that initial Nebraska campaign. That team started 0-6 and then won 4 of 6 down the stretch to finish 4-8. And their 2 losses were that loss to Iowa, last play of the game against the top 15 team in the country, and losing to Ohio State, who finished number 3 in the country by 5 points in Columbus in a really tight game. So, at that point, it was a feel-good 4-8. Hey, look at what we did. We just won 4 out of 6, and we took 2 really good teams to the wire versus where we are 3 years later.
Yeah, and I'll give you a good comparison for the just expectations, even with scores in a game comparatively. If you look at the first couple of years of an era as opposed to years 5 and 6 or 4 and 5, even. Look at Brett Bielema. I've said it all season long. This has been a terrific season for Illinois. There's no other way to. Maybe I'm just a closet Brett Bielema fan, but and I know that they've won more. Isn't that funny? They've won more than Nebraska. That's a fact. But at the same time, they've also gotten. And I have to look back. They haven't gotten blown out a lot this year, but Nebraska's played closer in their losses than Illinois has. But again, obviously, if we compared Scott Frost and Brett Bielema this year, I mean, there's no question you're saying Brett Bielema had the better year coaching. And their records are comparable. And part of it, again, is because they won at Penn State and they've won more games, but they've also just the fact that this is year 1 with Brett and they've done what they've done is outstanding.
And when you talk to the ardent Nebraska supporter, and more so the ardent supporter of Scott Frost, they will tell you it's taken time to implement the system, change the culture, weed out the players who didn't want to buy in, who didn't want to be there, completely turn over a deteriorated strength and conditioning program that had not been up to anywhere close to Nebraska standards during the Mike Riley era, all those things. But you bring up Brett Bielema, the Illinois roster's in no great shakes. It's nowhere close to Nebraska. Nebraska, even during the Mike Riley stay, for as many issues as there were in handing that program to Scott Frost, he did hand him a roster full of classes that were in the top 25 in the country, as
Good
opposed
point.
to Illinois in the 50s, 60s.
Yeah.
And Brett Bielema steps in and he beats Minnesota, beats Penn State. And as you made that comment about their competitiveness, meaning Illinois in the Big Ten, I was kind of reviewing the games in my head. Really, Wisconsin was the only game that they weren't competitive.
Yeah, and you know who else Illinois beat week 0?
Yeah.
So,
exactly.
that's a great point, Mark. That's just, again, given what they had returning, totally valid. And that's why you obviously, Trev Alberts has already taken all that into account. And again, I think Scott knows where he stands heading into this game regardless.